Hey, this is Warren Redlick. The Tesla Semi event was yesterday. We're going to dive into a lot of little details. Particularly right at the beginning, I want to talk about why Tesla Semi matters, but also how it compares to Model Y. Which matters more? Is Model Y more important than Tesla Semi? Is Semi more important than Model Y? How big is this Tesla Semi story in the scale of everything that's going on with Tesla? I'll give you a highlight. It's important, but it's not as big of a deal as people want it to be. And the other thing about this event was I thought it was short on detail. When they presented Semi 5 years ago, it was a big deal. They gave a lot of detail on what they were doing. This particular event, they didn't give a lot of detail, but there were some really juicy details. Are you ready? Let's go. So I want to start with this. If you look at what maybe the expectation is for Tesla Semi, I'm being optimistic in saying that Semi might deliver 200,000 vehicles at some point in the future. I think that's a reasonable goal. That not just the US, but the US and other countries, they should be able to do 200,000 vehicles. The US market is about 200,000 semis, so 200,000 would be the entire US market, but semis should be viable in China and Europe. So good ballpark, 200,000 vehicles, probably 3 or 4 years from now, if not 5 years from now. Model Y is approaching 1.5 million vehicles a year. We think it's going to get to 1.5 million vehicles a year, and probably will get to 2 million vehicles a year at some point. So that gives you a sense of, there's 10 times as many Model Ys as there are semis. Semi has a roughly 900 kilowatt hour battery pack, where Model Y has an 80 kilowatt hour battery pack. In other words, Semi requires more than 10 times the battery cells of a Model Y. So it's using a lot of batteries, and that's a big cost. And that's also, those are batteries that can't be used for another vehicle. So when you make a Semi, you could have made 10 Model Ys or even 11 or 12 Model Ys with the same number of batteries. The total gigawatt hours used by Semi at 200,000 volume times 900 kilowatt hours each is 180 gigawatt hours, where Model Y, when you add them all together, you use 160 gigawatt hours. So you're taking up a lot. In a battery-constrained world, this matters. You're taking away from Model Y, you're taking away from Model 3, you're taking away from other vehicles Tesla might make, the future robotaxi vehicle, maybe from energy like Megapack or Powerwall. Now, with that said, I don't think, Tesla's already getting close to 2 million Model Ys, and they're already getting close to whatever other vehicle production, except for this robotaxi platform vehicle, which is probably going to use lithium iron phosphate batteries. So Semi's use of battery cells doesn't really take away from Tesla's vehicle production. I thought that might be a concern. As I look at it now, I don't think it's that big of a concern. Now you look at the price of the vehicles, and the Semi is $250,000 ballpark. When they first announced it was $180,000. There's a $40,000 tax credit. Inflation happened, so my gut hunch is going to be at least $250,000. Very possible they sell this thing down the road for $300,000 or even $400,000. But I'm using $250,000 for now because they originally said $180,000, and I think this is a reasonable jump in price. Where Model Y is a ballpark $70,000. It's less than that, but then when you add an FSD, an average number of vehicles with FSD, you're probably talking about $70,000 in revenue for Model Y. I think the Chinese Model Ys sell for less, actually. So somewhere in that ballpark, maybe 60,000. These are just ballpark numbers. So when you look at total revenue generated, 200,000 semis times $250,000, you get $50 billion in revenue a year, where Model Y, you get $140 billion in revenue a year. This is why for Tesla as a company, Model Y is still much more important than Semi. You can't really escape that. It's just harsh, cold reality. They're going to sell a lot more Model Ys than they're going to sell semis. And this leaves out the potential for Model Y to go into robotaxi use and generate a lot more revenue. Now, the other thing is, assuming Model Y goes into robotaxi use, and each Model Y replaces 5 regular internal combustion engine vehicles, because a typical vehicle drives 2 hours a day, a robotaxi probably drives 10 or more hours a day on average. I think it actually might be 16 hours a day, so you might replace more than this, but you're displacing 10,000 internal combustion engine vehicles with Model Y. With Semi, you're not really displacing that many diesel semis, because the typical diesel Semi already runs 12, 16 hours a day. I think Semi has more uptime. It's going to need less maintenance, it's going to have less downtime. So Semi will probably replace 1.5 diesel semis, but it's just a much bigger impact in this sense. Now, there's a pollution side of the story, which we're going to get to later in this video. where semi does have an outsized impact. Diesel semis have an outsized pollution impact on the environment. And Tesla semi replacing that is a really big deal in reducing that environmental impact of semis. But still, I think overall, Model Y is much more important to Tesla's mission in so many ways. So what happens with Model Y is more important. That doesn't mean semi is unimportant. $50 billion in revenue a year, if that's what semi is going to head to, Tesla's revenue this year, 2022, is going to be about $80 billion. So if it was this year that they were producing 200,000 semis, that would be a monster deal. But they're not going to get to semi, in that volume for 4 or 5 years. And by that point, Tesla's overall revenue is going to be $500 billion a year. So it's going to be maybe 10% of the company revenue at some point down the road. Not nothing, still important overall for the company, important for society, kind of cool, but just wanted to clarify that. Now let's talk about emissions. And Elon's going to explain this. I'm just going to let Elon talk here.
People might wonder why build a semi-truck. Because if you look at the actual unit volume, it's small compared to passenger vehicles. So for passenger vehicles, there's on the order of almost 100 million that are sold every year. And whereas semi-trucks, it's like for 400,000 or 500,000.
Not even, yeah. It's a couple 100,000 Class 8 trucks a year.
Globally.
Yeah. Or no. Sorry, that's US.
Yeah. So in the U.S., there's like 15 million passenger vehicles and a couple 100,000 semi-trucks. So it seems like a small percentage, but it's actually 20% of U.S. vehicle emissions because you've got a huge vehicle and it's being driven all the time. So when you factor in the number of hours driven and the weight that it's carrying, it's actually, although it's only 1% of vehicle production, it's 20% of vehicle emissions. And it's over a third of all the particulate emissions. So from a sort of health standpoint, particularly in like cities, this is a huge impact, like it's gigantic.
So I just want to put up these numbers that Elon's talking about, that they're 1% of U.S. vehicles, that they account for 20% of U.S. vehicle emissions, and they account for 36% of U.S. particulate emissions. So, that's a very, very big deal. But Elon is leaving out a little bit of the story. It is true that today's fleet of diesel semis emits a ridiculous amount of particulate emissions, a ridiculous amount of CO2 emissions, etc. And the CO2 emissions, I don't think have changed. But if you look by year, over time, the emission standards have gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. And the most recent emissions down here, diesel semis are much better than they were in the past. Their particulate emissions are much lower. Their hydrocarbon emissions are lower. Their nitrous oxide emissions are much, much lower. So a lot of the emissions of diesel semis from the past, if a current Tesla semi displaces an old diesel semi, obviously that's better. But a new diesel semi would also replace an old diesel semi. So you really want to compare it to the latest diesel semis, and they're much better on emissions. They still emit more than regular cars by a lot. They're driven a lot more. They're using a lot more fuel. So they're putting a lot more emissions out there. But the practical reality is that the particulate emissions and diesel emissions over the next 20 years, we're going to go down a lot anyway. Semi accelerates that a lot. If I understand correctly, I think that chart was a little bit misleading. I think this is true today, but over time, diesel semis, the fleet is going to convert to the newest version of the fleet, and those emissions are going to come down quite a bit. So let's talk about what I thought was one of the most exciting. There's two things that really stood out to me, but one thing that stood out to me the most maybe was this bit from Dan Priestley, who is the senior manager of truck engineering for Tesla, if I've got his name right or his title right. Listen to this.
Enabled by our new 1,000-volt powertrain, which is the first vehicle that we're doing with that. And don't worry, there'll be some more vehicles coming with that.
So number one, it has a 1,000-volt powertrain. Current Teslas have a 400-volt powertrain. Porsche has an 800-volt powertrain for the Taycan. Lucid Motors has been bragging about their greater than 900-volt powertrain. I think it's technically 924-volt powertrain. And there's some significant efficiency to be gained by going to higher voltage. I think it allows you to lower the amps, which there's efficiencies there. I don't claim to be an electrical engineer. I don't fully understand it. I just know others have said going to higher voltage creates greater efficiencies. So not only does Semi have a 1,000-volt architecture, great, efficiency is great, but also other vehicles will have this. I think it's pretty clear from the presentation that Cybertruck is going to be 1000 volt. I think it's also possible that we're going to see Robotaxi, the future Robotaxi vehicle, might run on 1000 volts. Interesting. And then if you remember back to the Plaid, when they were talking about Plaid, there was this promise of a Plaid Plus, which they ultimately decided not to make. A Plaid Model S Plus and maybe a Model X Plaid Plus that was going to have certain advantages. And I think it's possible that Plaid will go to 1000 volts, that there will be a future Model S and X that will go to 1000 volt architecture. Why? Because you're going to see this later. They're running the Plaid Powertrain in the Semi. So if they're running the Plaid Powertrain in the Semi, then you can switch Model S and Model X to the same Plaid Powertrain that they're using in the Semi now and go to 1000 volt architecture. And that could make Model S and Model X that much more efficient, which would be a big plus. You know, those are an even smaller share of the future of the company, Model S and Model X, but it is cool. So I think we're going to see Cybertruck 1000 volt. We're probably going to see Robotaxi platform vehicle 1000 volt. We're probably going to see a van at some point that's going to be 1000 volt. And then the question is, will Model Y and Model 3 eventually be converted over to 1000 volt? There's been talk about a Model 3 refresh. Well, what if the Model 3 refresh went to 1000 volt architecture? What gains would that have? Especially with some other stuff we're going to talk about in a minute. Here we're going to talk about the Plaid Powertrain.
We've got a TriMotor powertrain system. So, and we're using the carbon overwrap sleeve. So essentially, we're using the Plaid Model S, Model X powertrain, actually enabling the two of the drive units to actually disconnect, so that they're not free spinning. So the efficiency is actually much greater in cruise.
So this is an important detail. What you're seeing here is closer to my finger is the front wheels and the front motor. And then further back here, you've got the rear wheels, or there's multiple wheels on a Semi, but there's more than, I think there's more than two. There's 3 or 4, I don't know. There's 2 motors back here, and this is the Plaid Powertrain, right? You've got 1 motor up front and 2 motors in the rear. But that was a critical detail, that they've designed it now so that the motors can disengage, and so they're not spinning and they're not using energy when you're at highway speed. You get a much greater efficiency. I don't believe that Model S and Model X Plaid Powertrain do this. My gut hunch is they're going to do this with Cybertruck, and that's going to increase Cybertruck efficiency, which is a big deal because Cybertruck needs that efficiency to get more range. And again, if we're going to see a Plaid Plus and a Plaid Plus S and a Plaid Plus X in the future, maybe they're going to go to this type of situation where you can disengage the rear wheels when you're at highway speeds, disengage the rear motors when you're at highway speeds. And maybe we're going to see that happen with 3 and Y, and maybe that's going to happen with the Robotaxi platform vehicle. My gut hunch is the Robotaxi platform vehicle is going to be single motor anyway, but you can see significant gains in efficiency coming from this. Semi has spectacular efficiency. They were able to get 500 miles of range, but let's dive a little further into this video before we go on.
Yeah, this is really unique. I mean, we're going with the TriMotor system. One of them is constantly engaged, so that's for maximum efficiency. You're getting on the highway, that's doing the bulk of the work, and it's operating at the peak efficiency point of the entire drivetrain. And then the other 2 units are for torque and acceleration. So when the driver needs it to get their job done, whether that's getting out of a loading dock or it's on the road, they need to pass somebody, you're tackling a grade, you have the torque and power to do it. And the cool thing is that these are clutched automatically, so no driver input needed, but it's also seamless. So the highway efficiency unit is cruising along doing its thing, and if the driver puts their foot to the floor, the torque unit spin up, clutch engages, and takes over, and it does all of that before we've maxed out the torque on the efficiency unit, so it's completely smooth. There's no turbo lag or jerkiness or anything like that. No driver input needed. It's smooth, both in terms of acceleration and deceleration for regen. It's really cool happening all behind the scenes.
So this is just an important step for Semi, getting the range it needs to carry 82,000 pounds, 500 miles. That's a big deal. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then you can see how their learnings from the cars, if you follow the whole event, the learnings from the cars led to improvements in Semi, and learnings from Semi are likely to contribute to future vehicle advantages. And it seems to me very likely that we're going to see this disengaging motors on Cybertruck at highway speed. And I know, like my Plaid Model X, I would love to get some more range. If they could do this on the Plaid X and maybe the regular X and get an extra 10 or 20 miles of range, it's surprising how nice it is to just get an extra 10 or 20 miles of range. Just a little thing like that can be a big deal. I suspect it's more than that, But even if it's only like a 5% gain, it's a big deal when you're doing a road trip. I've done a lot of road tripping in my X. I've got 27,000 miles in less than 6 months. Drove to California and back, Austin, Texas and back, New York and New Hampshire and back. I've done a lot of road tripping. And if you can extend, you can eliminate a couple of charging stops along the way. These gains are a big deal. So let's talk about that 500 miles of range. They showed this graphic, and you can see that they started in Fremont over here, and they were at 97% state of charge. They weren't at 100%, and they got to San Diego at 4% state of charge. So with 93% of the battery, they got 500 miles of range, and this includes going up a big hill and coming down a big hill, which is going to, although you get some regen on the way down, you don't get as much back as you used going up. So it does increase it does hurt the range more than it's going on flat surface. So they got 500 miles on 97%. I did some math. That means the range is really about 537 miles. Pretty amazing. And later, Elon tweeted that it has they're doing better than 1.7 miles per kilowatt hour. They're doing better than 1.7 kilowatt hours per mile. So I think that works out to an 850 to 900 kilowatt hour pack. I'm guessing they're going with a 900 kilowatt hour pack. Another detail was they showed this graphic, and I just love the way this graphic looks, that you can see, looking particularly at the front, this is what a diesel semi looks like. And Tesla semi is shorter. You can see that the front of the semi is shorter, and it's a much smoother shape. So you get a tremendous advantage in coefficient of drag. You still have the same frontal surface area. It's as wide and it's as tall, roughly. I mean, there's a tiny difference here or there. But the real advantage is the coefficient of drag. It's just so much more efficient than a typical diesel semi. And this length difference might matter for other countries. Like, I think for Tesla to make this vehicle work in Europe, they're going to have to shrink they're going to have to shrink this a little bit more. They have to get a little, the regular diesel semi, I think, is 20 feet long from front to the back of the cab. And I'm guessing Tesla semi is about 17 feet or 16 feet. In Europe, you want to get down to 10 feet. And I have a feeling Tesla will be able to make that work when they decide to export this to Europe. Next, let's talk about supercharging. This is a really big deal. The mega charger for semi, so that, you've got a 900 kilowatt hour pack, you want to be able to charge it fast. They've got a solution.
Obviously, to charge a truck like this quickly, you need a high-power charger. So we developed a megawatt class charger, as it's capable of charging at a megawatt to DC.
Yeah.
And it's our next generation immersive cooling, so it's liquid cooled.
I just want to be, for context for people who don't know, the current V3 superchargers are 250 kilowatts, which means when they're charging at their peak rate, which is maybe from 10% to 30% of the battery, once the battery starts to get charged up enough, they have to slow down the charging to not damage the battery. But for that, at that 250 kilowatt rate, in theory, you could charge a 250 kilowatt hour battery in an hour. Now, my Model X has a 100 kilowatt hour pack. So in that first, 20%, you're getting like insanely fast charging. So you can imagine if you go to 4 times the charge rate, that's going to be a big deal. And you're charging a lot faster. And this is going to matter more. You'll see in a minute.
You don't need like a gigantic elephant trunk of a cable. You can actually have a small cable, and that cable delivers a megawatt. Yeah, with 3x the current density.
I mean, this is really cool stuff. I mean, you're actually immersing the conductor in the coolant, this water-based coolant that we have, and we're then doing some really neat isolation monitoring on the back end to ensure that it's safe and delivering that it needs to. But it means that we can really shove a lot of current in a very, very small place. So, for those that have worked and charged their cars on a V3 supercharger, and the cable's nice and maneuverable, it's the same thing here, but now we're just shoving a megawatt through it instead. So, this is key for high-power applications like semi. But you want to tell them, or do you want me to tell them?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be used for Cybertruck too.
Yeah. So this is coming to our superchargers next year.
So that's a big deal. So now Cybertruck will be able to charge at a megawatt. I don't think a Model X or Model S or any other Tesla vehicle is going to be able to take full advantage of 1 megawatt of charging. And I don't know how they're going to do this. I don't think the port that's going with this new V4 charger is going to fit in a regular vehicle, in the existing vehicle. So they may have to, at some point, the new vehicles are going to have a different port to be able to accept both. They didn't say whether existing vehicles would be able to accept this charger. So with Cybertruck, my gut hunch is they may go as high as a 200 kilowatt hour pack in Cybertruck. I'd like to see if they could do it with 150 kilowatt hours. Maybe it's 160, maybe it's 170 kilowatt hours, or even 180. But if they go to a 200 kilowatt hour pack and they're able to get 1 megawatt in, there's a question, there's a certain limit to how fast you can charge a battery based on how big the battery is. So I don't know how long you're going to get a megawatt, but this does mean you might be able to charge Cybertruck faster, and it may be that the 4680, if Cybertruck's going to be using 4680 batteries, it may be that the 4680 battery design is able to accept a higher charge rate. So if that happens, this is fantastic, and we're going to see Cybertruck charging super fast. It's going to have a bigger battery pack, so it needs to charge fast, but it should be able to charge really fast because of this new generation of superchargers. And then you have this question, well, wait a minute, will there be a next generation Model Y charging layout? And this is why you might see the entire fleet go to 1,000 volt down the road so they can take advantage of V4 supercharging, because we're going to see these V4 superchargers in a lot of places. Now, it may be that Tesla says, you know what, we're going to continue to deploy V3 superchargers while we're deploying V4 superchargers, and they probably have a plan for this, and I'm sure Drew Baglino's on top of it. So Drew, I want to hear from you. What's the plan? I don't know when we're going to get this plan, but we're going to start seeing it. And they said V4 will be next year. So my gut hunch is you're going to see a few of these in places where they're delivering semi and limited volume today. So Pepsi and Frito-Lay are going to have one. But we're not going to see these V4 superchargers deployed in volume yet. When Cybertruck comes out, and maybe shortly before Cybertruck comes out, we're probably going to start seeing V4 superchargers appearing in places so that Cybertruck can charge. And my guess would be that there going to have to be some level of backward compatibility. So at least Cybertruck will be able to charge from V3 superchargers. New vehicles that can take the V4 will be able to charge from V3 and V2. That's my gut hunch, that they will make that work. Will they make it so that a current generation vehicle can charge from a V4? I don't know if they can make that work. My gut hunch is they're going to try, but we'll see what happens. And just thinking about semi in general, that semi is important. It's not as important as Model Y. It's not as important as the robotaxi platform vehicle, but it's still something that's potentially 10% of Tesla revenue in 4 or 5 years, right? I think we can see where that can go. It's still a big deal in reducing global emissions, protecting like both emissions, CO2 emissions and other pollutants, but also particularly for people who live near roadways. If you can reduce particulate emissions even more, that's better from them. And fundamentally, one of the things I left out was they had a lot of detail about how they're making trucking safer. I didn't feel like there was a good way of explaining that, but just like going down a hill, the regen means you're not using your brakes don't get hot, and trucks have runaway problems. Diesel semis have runaway problems where the brakes fail, and then you can't stop the truck. Because the Tesla Semi is slowing down primarily with regen, with using the motors to slow the vehicle and taking that energy back into the battery pack and making the vehicle more efficient, they don't really have brake issues with a Tesla Semi. And also there's a maintenance issue that you're not going to have to replace the brakes as much. So it's a much less expensive vehicle to operate in so many ways. The electricity is cheaper than diesel fuel. There's less maintenance in a variety of ways. There's less moving parts. So many advantages to this thing. It's really exciting. What do you think about Tesla Semi? Let me know in the comments below. What do you think about the event? What do you think about Semi? I wish they had more details. I'm a little disappointed in that. It was cool to see Dan Priestley talking. I don't know if we'd seen him speak before. I thought he spoke really well. But other than that, please check out the merch. Be Less Wrong t-shirt. You've got the Tesla stainless steel water bottle, both at elonbits.com. Check out my other videos. Please support me on Locals, on Patreon, or as a YouTube channel member. Check out my other videos. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.